With that being said, wanted to, again, I know I kind of mentioned myself previously that I'm the co-founder and chief operating officer of Diversio, but I am also responsible in our organization for our engineering, our product, and ultimately our implementation. And before Diversio, I was in academia, so I was looking at big data studies, underpinning the bottom line benefits of diversity and inclusion to an organization. So with an inclusive culture, what kind of meaningful business ROI can we actually lift out? How does it actually impact our organizations? Of course, it's the right thing to do, but it is also the good thing to do for business. And I think, again, given the economy and given the tenuous sort of nature of the work that we do sometimes, I think that ROI can be very, very important to us. So now I'm keen to jump into the first workshop. The first real workshop is Retention Renassaince, the ROI behind diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies for keeping talent. Now, a little bit of housekeeping before I get going. I see that a lot of folks have already been posting in the chat, and that's wonderful to see. We have folks moderating the chat room. So if you're asking questions just about the logistics, or if you're asking kind of small, like less technical questions, they'll be able to help you and to answer them in the chat itself. If not, please definitely raise your hand or ask questions in the chat as we're going through the workshops, and we would love to be answering them at the end of our sessions when we're kind of have the interactive portion. The idea here is to really have the community come together and ask questions and collaborate together. So definitely would love to see your questions as we're going through this session. So just getting started on our agenda for this particular workshop. The first thing that we're going to be talking about is the cost of attrition. After that, we're going to be focusing on understanding, okay, if our employees are leaving, how do we uncover why they're leaving? We'll be looking at how to assess the data and how to draw insights for it that will help us ensure retention. After that, we'll be looking at answering some questions on how to combat attrition and ultimately how to ensure that our employees are staying, they're happy, they're productive and activated. And then we're going to wrap up with connecting all of the dots and showing you building out that ultimate ROI case, looking at how inclusion and attrition and retention are very closely connected. So I'm sure this isn't coming as a surprise to anyone on the call. We have lots of HR practitioners, diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners. The need to retain talent is higher than ever. Replacing employees is incredibly expensive for our organizations with oftentimes invisible costs. Of course, we want employees to stay for a variety of reasons. We want to build a community within our organization. We want to ensure productivity. We want to have that transfer of knowledge. But during good economic times, we ultimately, this might be less of a flag that retention must be our highest priority. At the moment, for the majority of organizations, retention can actually be one of the top costs to an organization's bottom line. So the churn of talent. Replacing an employee is incredibly expensive. We are looking at the US and Canada, obviously similar numbers, but at a smaller scale. Lost productivity costs US businesses about $1.8 trillion annually. Turnover costs US businesses an additional $1 trillion annually. Losing an employee generally can cost a company 1.5 to 2 times the employee's salary on average to replace that individual. So those are huge costs, and especially the larger the organization, the more churn a company might be experiencing, the higher those costs are to a business. And the kind of the monetary upfront costs are not the only cost to an organization. 2/3 of all sunk costs due to turnover are intangible. So this is looking at loss of productivity, loss of knowledge, loss of that historical source of knowledge that the employee has accumulated and brings to the business. This can oftentimes during the transition periods, I'm sure all of us are familiar. If we're onboarding someone new, there's a delay in deadlines, there's the knowledge gap that often exists. And then, of course, for our teams, this is a big depletion of team morale from the additional workload and loss of a colleague. This is a predictor of increased likelihood of also future churn. So it's something that will continue kind of rolling down and getting bigger, almost snowballing. So if you're looking at the next slide here, what you'll be able to see is some statistics that I think are really quite interesting and, could be worth taking back to your leadership team, could be worth taking back to your organization. If you're looking at employee turnover as an expense, where it lands from a pure numbers perspective, to replace an entry-level employee, you're going to be looking at spending about 30 to 50% of their annual salary to replace that individual. And that goes into the gap that oftentimes occurs with that individual rolling off and bringing on someone new. That also looks at the training that needs to be invested into the new individual. It looks at the onboarding process and the delay there. So 30 to 50% for a junior employee. For a mid-level employee, you're looking at spending about 150% of their annual salary in order to replace that person. So if you have a mid-level employee who is making maybe $80,000 or $90,000 a year, or whatever that amount is, you are looking at spending more than that. You're looking at spending 1.5 times that amount just to replace that individual. And that is for one person. If you're looking at high level or highly specialized employee, a lot of us now, of course, have data scientists working for us and AI engineers, and we have very specialized personnel working in our organizations. You're oftentimes looking at 400% their salary. So that is 4 times their annual salary to replace one individual. Those costs can add up if there is something that is driving high churn in our organizations. And so the question then becomes, okay, if we're experiencing employee churn within our companies, what do we do about it, and how do we reduce it? If we're seeing that employees are leaving at a disproportionate rate or being let go at a disproportionate rate, that is something that we must address, because it is a huge cost center to our business, of course, and for all the reasons that we discussed right now. So the first thing that we ultimately recommend, the first thing that we need to be doing, is we need to understand who the employees are. So we need to have a really strong understanding of, across the organization, across our company, who are our employees. Now, there's a lot of conversation about collecting diversity data, collecting data from our employees on their demographics and who they are. We are a company that helps with that. So we, as a third-party provider, go in and we ask employees of organizations about their identities, their demographics, things like gender, race, sexual orientation, disability, mental health. But this is something you can also do yourselves. You don't need to work with a third-party provider. But ultimately, collecting this data with employees will be the first step to unlocking patterns and trends into why we might be losing our talent. It's important to also know here that there are 2 main ways that we can be asking employees to self-identify. The first way is the anonymous route. So when an employee will fill out a survey and they will share their demographics or their identities, but they will not share their names or emails or IDs or anything like that. This is a really great way to start collecting data from your employees, especially if that trust isn't necessarily there yet. Also, this is a great way to collect the data from your employees if you're collecting it yourselves, because a lot of the time employees might not necessarily trust the process yet, or they might be hesitant to share this data with you because they won't know how it will necessarily be used. We find that if you're using a third-party provider, though, especially if you've been using them for a couple of years, employees tend to be more trusting. And so in this case, what we do and what we have started doing most recently and are seeing really big gains from it is asking employees to share their demographic information along with some sort of identifier. So this can be an email address or this can be an employee ID. I prefer employee IDs because then we don't know who the employee is. We just have an identifier that connects them to their string of responses. But ultimately, what you will see this allows us to do is collecting employee ID with employee demographics will allow us to combine data sets later on. So extract additional data from an HR platform regarding, for example, attrition rates or departure rates, connect it with how an employee identifies, and then gain meaningful insights from that. But I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Looking at the next slide, now that we have our employee demographics, employee identities, now that we know, which employees maybe have a disability or a mental health condition, which employees are of what racial background or ethnic background, we want to overlay this data with HR data to see trends. So if we, for instance, see that employee 3456 identifies as a woman with a disability, and we also pull data from our HR platform and we combine the two data together and we see that employee 3456 was let go last year, then this is something that we can begin building on. If we pull data on aggregate on all of our employees and combine the movement, the mobility of employees from our HR platform with what we know about employee identities, we will start to be able to understand, are there trends in who is leaving our organization? Potentially, we might be able to find that employees with a disability are leaving at a disproportionately higher rate. So for employees who have a disability identified within our organization, we can see that their departure rate is 60% across this business compared to employees without a disability who are significantly lower. So this is the first step in uncovering what is driving attrition or what is driving churn, employee turnover within our organization. Here we see that employees with a disability are disproportionately more likely to leave the business. Now that we know this, the question is, now what? One of the most important things from a data collection perspective is, of course, to understand, now that we have a feeling of representation across our company, we also need to know levels of inclusion. So while we're collecting data on demographics from our employees, that's all well and good. It allows us to understand, what is the diversity across our organization? What does that look like across the business? That's excellent. That's a really great start. But we also need to know, how are our employees feeling? What is their experience? Are they included? Do they have positive interactions with their peers? Do they feel like leaders are invested in their growth within the company? Do they have the flexibility that they need in order to manage their personal and professional obligations? This is the second part of that data intake, that surveying that I mentioned. We go in and we collect diversity or demographic dimensions from our employees, but we also have to be collecting experience data from our employees. And pairing that with the demographic data becomes incredibly important to understanding why people who are leaving are leaving. Because if we understand people's experience as well as people's shared characteristics, that will give us the full picture of what might be driving a particular group of employees out of our business. And so this is what we're looking at here. We're seeing that, and diversity of terminology here is the dominant group. So for this particular organization, the dominant group is the profile of person that appears most frequently at the executive level. So in this company, it was white, heterosexual men without a disability. And so we're seeing, how is the dominant group scoring on our inclusion metrics, such as culture and fair management, relative to folks with a disability, relative to employees who have a disability. And if the scores are out of 100, which they are, we're seeing that the dominant group is feeling not amazing, but they're feeling quite good in a lot of the areas. They're feeling that the workplace is relatively flexible. They're feeling that the workplace is relatively safe, that the culture is inclusive, that their peers welcome them. But for employees with a disability, we're seeing that their scores are meaningfully lower. There's a delta between how the dominant group is feeling in the organization and how employees with a disability are feeling. We're seeing that they're scoring quite low on career development. They don't really have mentors or sponsors. They're scoring low on workplace flexibility and workplace safety. And then looking at the free text at the bottom there, we're also seeing that employees who have a physical or cognitive or a mental condition, they're experiencing microaggressions from the workplace. There's an intolerance, for example, from a manager who doesn't understand that someone with dyslexia might learn a little bit differently, or they might take a little bit longer to read a document. There's not enough flexibility for another employee with a mental health condition who is looking to maybe take, an hour once a week or a couple of times a week to go to a therapy session. And that's not the flexibility that their workplace provides. So there's a pattern now that we're able to see. We're able to see that employees with a disability are leaving at a disproportionately higher rate. We're able to see who employees with a disability in the organization are, which allowed us to identify this. We're also able to see that employees with a disability are feeling meaningfully less included than others within the organization. They're struggling to feel connected to the company, and they're not empowered to do their best work. And so this is indicative of why they're leaving the company, why that churn and that attrition is building up for this particular group of employees. So a piece of research that we did last year, which I think is really interesting and relevant here, is that inclusion is a huge driver when it comes to attrition of an organization. We find that of employees who are dissatisfied in an organization, 79% are dissatisfied because of some sort of inclusion factor, which means that if the logic holds true, and I think it does, that dissatisfied employees tend to quit an organization, it means that the majority of dissatisfied employees are quitting because of inclusion factors, which is why it makes it even more important and even more necessary for us to collect this data in order to understand what is driving the behavior, who is leaving and why are they leaving. And that, knowing that, will allow us to hopefully start fixing the problem. And so once we understand why employees are leaving, we can take action to improve their experience. And so if we kind of pull up, I know that we have, these are one at a time, but we can actually, Kate is manning that, thank you. So here, what did we see throughout the examples that I've been going through? So we saw that we identified who has a disability within our organization. We saw that employees with a disability are much more likely to leave. And then we also saw that those individuals are having a meaningfully less inclusive time within the workplace. So what do we do next? How do we retain them? The idea is to fix the underlying problem. We want to make sure that they start feeling included. We want to make sure that they start feeling welcomed and empowered by their teams. And then as they start feeling more included, we will expect retention to go up. We will expect their attrition, their levels of leaving the organization to actually go down. And so what are some of the things that we can do? This is where it comes to best practice around implementing solutions, implementing programs and policies to address the challenges, the inclusion challenges that our employees are facing. And these are some of the things that you'll be very familiar with, of course, as practitioners, both on the HR side, on the DI side. So, when looking at employees with a disability, accessibility and accommodation is crucial for career development. So without proper accommodations, without creating particular opportunities, folks with a disability might be facing unnecessary barriers to their advancement. So how do we address that? How do we structure our career development opportunities? How do we make them more accessible? How do we make them more friendly? Fair management. Unconscious bias is a huge thing. But now that we know that there's potentially unconscious bias across our managers towards individuals with a disability in particular, this is something that we can be addressing in a much more targeted way. Instead of just doing blanket unconscious bias training, we know the particular group of employees that are facing the barriers, and now we can come to our leaders and our managers with a much more curated and custom set of recommendations, of intervention training. We can talk to them in a much more small smart and intelligent way about the way that they should be showing up for their colleagues, for their peers, for their direct reports who might have a disability. And then also workplace safety. So addressing things like microaggressions, things like inappropriate jokes towards this particular group of people. Maybe we want to organize an employee resource group to support individuals with disabilities. We want to make sure that the process for reporting any sort of harassment or reporting any sort of issues is set up and is robust. There's lots of things that we can start doing in terms of intervention. And ultimately, it turns into this process and this cycle, which will begin improving the culture and improving retention for your organizations. Once you identify who is leaving the company, you can understand why they're leaving the company. So in our case, people with a disability were leaving the organization at a disproportionate rate. This is costing the company a lot of money, like we just said, to replace those individuals. It's, both tangible and intangible, both, the cost that you can see, that dollar value, but also employee morale and productivity and innovation and that team dynamic. All of those things suffer as a result. So once we understand who is leaving, we understand why they're leaving, what is driving them out, what is their negative experience that is causing them to exit a company or, potentially an industry or what have you. We can start taking activities that, yes, probably will cost some resources and they will take some time and effort. But ultimately, the investing of those resources will drive up retention, and retention will save meaningful, huge amounts for your organization. And so that's ultimately sort of that cycle that we want to be implementing. So now really quickly, wanted to also talk through how we can help. Like I said, this is hopefully was a relatively helpful how-to on how you're able to do it yourselves or just what the process is. But we can also help you achieve this if you do need a little bit of extra support. Generally speaking, our platform integrates with your human resources information system or any sort of system of record that you keep. And we combine data, sorry, next slide, Kate. And we combine data that we ourselves collect directly from your employees on employee demographics and experience with employee movements and mobility within an organization. So exactly as I was talking about, we pull in demographics directly from your employees. So it's private, confidential. They're not sharing that information with you. And so they feel more comfortable that that information will be stored behind our firewall. But then we also pull in information and data on employee departures, for example, promotions, role changes, that sort of thing. And ultimately, we're able to process this analysis for you to help you pull out those insights that you need in order to start taking action and increasing retention. And of course, I was focused specifically on attrition costs today and the way that attrition impacts your business. It's a huge line item, of course. But we also encourage you to, and we do this ourselves, to look beyond that. So we want to look at promotion equity, right? Are people being promoted at similar rates? Is anyone being promoted meaningfully less frequently than other people? Maybe, maybe our people of color are only being promoted half the rate than our white colleagues. And of course, we want to be looking at pay equity as well. The conversation about the pay gap has been incredibly relevant over the past 2 years. And there's, a lot of reporting mandates that are coming out in different regions of the world. But we always say, like, let's go beyond gender for when looking at pay equity. Let's look at other dimensions, maybe invisible diversity dimensions, maybe visible diversity dimensions. But these are incredibly important to slice and dice the data with. So without further ado, I will take questions now. So I'm not sure, there's a lot happening in the chat, so I don't think that there are any questions, but okay. We do have a question. What is the international legality of collecting demographic data we haven't collected internally because the laws are so different across countries? Really, really great question. It is very complicated, so it's difficult for me to answer on this call. What I will say is we at Diversio, so we work with large multinationals. We cover over 40 countries globally, worldwide. I think probably more at this point from a data collection perspective. Within every country, well, I won't say every, but the vast majority of countries, you are able to collect at least some kind of demographic data. There are nuances in terms of how it's collected, what's done with it, how is it stored and processed, but you are able to do it. Of course, it's always easier to do it with a third party. As a data processor, it's a lot easier for us, for example, to go in and collect this information from your employees than for you to do it yourselves, but it is possible. We have developed a matrix, basically a legal matrix of major or, kind of covering the majority of the world from a regional perspective, looking at those nuances. If you are interested in sort of learning more about that, please reach out and we can kind of maybe have a conversation offline. It will be just more helpful for me to understand what regions you cover, and then I can be more articulate as to what legislation particularly touches them. But I will say that in Canada, you can collect practically all diversity information, very similar in the US. And in Europe, you can collect the majority, but you need to be very careful with how it's stored and processed. And that's under the GDPR. So the General Data Protection Regulation, I believe that's the acronym. But under GDPR laws, you can do it. It's just a little bit nuanced as to how. Yeah, 32 countries. That's very, very fair, Emily. We work with a lot of we work with a lot of international companies that are sort of in the same boat. Yes, we are GDPR compliant. Okay, so another question, will there be any interaction today, breakout groups? There won't be any breakout groups today because for the most part, we'll be having panelists and panel speakers throughout the duration of the day. But definitely if you have any questions or if you have anything that you want to discuss or be connected to anyone, please reach out and our team will make sure to do that. Will you be sharing examples of how to implement inclusion as empowerment tool for employees? Absolutely. So I'm not going to be doing this during this session, but my colleague, Nikkei, who's actually going to be speaking in about 5 minutes right after me, she will be talking about the practical implementation components of inclusion tools and inclusion programs and policies. And we will also be touching on that quite a bit this afternoon, where we actually have our practitioners and experts coming in who, live this every single day in their organizations. We have some multinationals present. We have some smaller companies. We have a very I think stacked panel today or list of panels. So I'm really excited for all of you to hopefully stick around for that. Any other questions for me before I hand it off to Nikkei? Will you be having any discussions on how to engage multi-generational employees to build a more inclusive working environment? That is a great question, Yolanda, and I think something definitely that should be discussed. I'm not sure if Nikkei will be touching on that, but it's absolutely something that we consider, and we take an age a lot as one of the diversity dimensions that we collect, and there are huge differences between how different generations experience the workplace. And so this is, I think, a really great question for potentially one of the panels this afternoon to kind of dig in and to see how their particular organizations are addressing or working multi-generationally. What I would do is I'd maybe take a look at the list of speakers for every single panel and see which companies' perspectives you're interested in hearing, and then this would be a great question to ask. Okay, awesome. So thank you to everyone who joined this morning, especially for folks on the West Coast. Without further ado, I will be passing it on to Nikkei, who will be leading you for our next workshop, From Scarcity to Abundance. Over to you, Nikkei.